Hey, this is Wes. In this video, we're going to take a look at how you can create a material from a single image using Substance Sampler. So I'm going to talk about how to process the image, also how to make the material seamless using some of the processing tools within Sampler. And at the end, we're going to take a look at using the Splatter filter to create some additional effects. So let's jump in and take a look. This is the source input image that I'm going to use for this tutorial. Now, normally I would just photograph the material. However, in this case, I didn't have any gingerbread in the house. So I used Adobe Firefly to generate this base image as a photograph. And now that I have this as the foundation, I can see that, well, there's some obvious issues with it. Like if we look at the lighting, it's kind of baked in, so I can see the highlights here and it's directional. So that's going to be an issue when I'm trying to create a seamless material. There's also some dark areas here. So what I'm going to do now is use this image. We're going to process it using Substance Sampler to create a seamless, physically based material. So I'm going to start by dragging and dropping that source image here into Sampler, and the material creation template appears. It knows that I'm trying to create a material from an image, so this is selected. Now, here I have my document size, and I'm going to switch this to 4K. And notice I have this upscale material. So here, let's just say I don't have this selected, and I click Import. Well, I get this dialog that appears, hey, potential quality loss. The resolution of the import image is at 2K. It's lower than the document size. And it's just letting me know that this linear upscale, it's going to affect the quality of the material. And it's recommending that I use upscale. So yeah, let's do that. Let's add the upscale. So you could just click that option if you wanted to beforehand. But that's what we've done now is we've added this upscale. So what it's doing is it's just intelligently upscaling the material so that we don't get any loss in quality. And with just that simple operation here in my 3D view, I can see that, well, I have my material, and here in the 2D view, I can see that I have some textures that have been generated from this image to material operation. So let's take a look at the channels that were created. I have my base color, I have normal, roughness, I have height information, I have ambient occlusion information. So all of this has been generated for me here. Now the upscale is great, but working at 4K is going to maybe slow down kind of the work that I'm doing a bit. So I usually will come over here to this upscale, and I'm just going to turn it off so it's not being computed. And then here for my document resolution, I'm going to set this to 2048. So I'm just going to work at 2K. And this is just, like I said, going to speed up my overall workflow. So the next thing that I want to do is jump over to image to material and start taking a look at the property settings here. We're going to make some changes. First thing I'll notice here from the basic parameters is there's a category option. And if I click this drop down, there's lots of different options here depending on the type of material I'm trying to create. A different algorithm is going to be used. Now, by default, it's looking at this going, oh, this is a ground. Well, it's not a ground, so it's not really creating for me, I think the result of the texture generation is not really, giving me exactly what I want yet. So let's see if we can choose a different option to get a little closer. And there's lots of options. Well, there's not a gingerbread option, so I'm just going to choose organic, and that's going to reprocess. And you'll notice here that my texture maps will change just a little bit because, like I said, we're using a different algorithm. So we'll give that a second to compute, and then it gives me a slight change. So already you can see there's a change. I'm getting a bit more reflective here inside of my 3D view. If I look at it, my normal and roughness maps have changed just a bit. So that's fine. That's what I want to do. I think this is a little bit closer to what I want. Looking at this, I do think this is a bit too reflective. So let's see what we can do in terms of parameters. There is a section here for material type, and this is saying matte or shiny. And I do want some reflectivity in this, but I think this is going to be more of a closer to a matte surface. It's too shiny right now, so I do have roughness information that I can change, like the base value and variations. So I'm going to increase the base value. So I just drag my slider here that's going to recompute, and it generates a new version of that roughness map. So again, it's a matter of just making a visual tweak and then seeing what that looks like. So I think that's a little bit too much. I'm going to drop it down to like, say, 0.65. And this is getting me a little bit closer, I think, into the ballpark of what I want to work with here. You know what? Let's drop it down even further. So I'm going to say 0.55, hit enter. There we go. Okay, so I think that's going to work. That's going to give me the roughness that I want. Now, there's some other options I have, like variations. If I lower the variation, you can see it kind of reduces the overall kind of contrast, which may be what I'm going for. Or if I increase it, it's going to give me a little bit more contrast. So I don't think, well, I don't know. It's just a matter of what you want to do. Like now I'm kind of, maybe I want to do that. I don't know, too much. Let's just back it off a little bit. Let's just try taking this down to like, I'm going to do 0.6. And so if we look at this, yeah, I think I'll just go with that. All right, looks pretty good. You also have albedo importance. So if I drag this slider and say, let's just set it closer to 1, you can now see I'm getting these white specks in here. So what are these? Well, if I jump over to the base color, which is my albedo, you can see that the white is actually, it's bringing in detail from the base color and bringing that into the roughness. And sometimes that can really help create some nice variation. In this case, it's seeing these kind of dark values of these kind of where it was cracks in the bread and you get this occluded value. It's bringing that into the roughness and just making those occluded values rough. So you know what? I think I'm going to leave that. It looks pretty good. I definitely would want those to be kind of rough. No, we're basically it's blocking any kind of reflectivity from those areas based on the data we're putting into our roughness. So that looks pretty good as well. The next thing we want to look at is our normal map. So if we look at the normal, that's going to be controlled here through geometry details. Actually, it's controlling our height information, which is then converting and creating our normal. So what I'm going to do here is, and you know what, I need to check on that because I might actually have that backwards. I can't remember. The image to material, it might be generating normal and then converting that to height. It's one or the other. I think I might have it. I may have it backwards. I'm not sure. But either way, just know that geometry details, it's going to be able to let me control my normal and height. So for example, if I set the micro details all the way to 0, it's going to recompute and it just kind of smooths out the normal. So I don't have any of those little micro details and this looks a little bit too mushy. So I do want to have micro details, maybe not too much so it doesn't look so super sharp. So again, let's set this to maybe 0.6. I have things like my medium and large details that I could add into this. So for example, if I just increase the large detail, get a little bit more of these kind of larger shapes showing up. Again, like I said, it is affecting my height information. You can see it here. If I increase the large detail, you'll see what it does in the height here. So let's just take that back down to, let me 0.55 in that case. And there we go. It's making a change. Let's go back to our normal. And I think this is going to work. Now, one other thing I want to look at here with this, if I go back to my base color, there is this delighting intensity. So when I first was discussing that source image, I was saying that, well, the source image has some issues because it has some I can see some directional lighting baked into the image in the sense that you could see the reflection. And the image to material filter has completely blocked out that specular highlights. That's awesome. That's what I want to have. And I can control that here through my delighting intensity. It's also removed some of these darkened areas that I was having a little bit of a trouble with. But you know, you got to be careful because it could obliterate like a lot of the details. So you have this slider. If I take this down, maybe like 0.32, you can see I'm bringing back a little bit of that detail, which is I think what I want to do. So I don't want to knock it completely out, but overall we get a nice kind of albedo value. This is our diffuse reflected color when we're talking about, you know, physically based materials. So here in my scene, this is my material. It's looking pretty good so far. Well, I definitely have some tiling issues, right? So let's tackle that next. So if I come over to my 2D view and I hit the T key on the keyboard, that's T for tiling. This lets me see a tiling view and definitely have some problems here. The main thing that I see, we're going to take this as like a twofold approach. So the first thing, we definitely have an issue with a discrepancy between our light values and our dark values. And that gives a very, we can easily see that we have this repeating problem. So the next thing I like to do, I'll jump over to my filters and I'm going to add here an equalizer. So let's do equalizer. So there's my equalizer. And you can see I'm adding this on top of my upscale. That's fine because later when we're done, we're going to increase the upscale. So then all of these operations we're going to do on top are going to be recomputed at 4K. But like I said, we'll do that. We'll enable that last after we've done our work. So now I have this control for radius. And as I decrease the radius, you can see it kind of happens here in real time. I can basically kind of affect that like I said, that balance between light and dark values. If I set it all the way to 0, well, yeah, we get this is a great tileable image, but all of my detail, everything's gone. It just doesn't look right. So let's increase the radius, and it's just a matter of just finding a nice sweet spot. So I think this is looking okay. I still have some detail here, but again, it's not super strong. And if I zoom out here, you can easily see it if I just enable the layer. So here's what it looks like with it, with no equalization and lots of tiling issues. Let's enable it. Okay, slightly better. Still have some seams, still have some problems, but overall that helped. So the next step is to then come over to our add layer and use our tiling filter. So I'll add tiling, and now I have this manipulator here in my 2D view, and this allows me to just move the image around. I can just left click and drag here on the corners to like scale this down and just reposition the textures. And so what it's doing now is it's trying to like kind of cut, and I don't know, it's like cutting and pasting the image together so that we can, see exactly how the seams are going to work. And speaking of seams, I can come over here to my basic parameters and I can enable show seam. So this is going to be super helpful. Let's enable it. And this shows me the seams that I'm getting here in the 2D view. If I come over to my edge and I turn off detect edges, this lets me see the actual seams that are being generated here. And what's interesting about this is this is kind of takes me back to the old school way. If you were, long time ago, if you used Photoshop, we'd go to filter, offset the image, and then clone stamp the seam. But this is like the result of the filter offset values that you would enter. But now with Substance, we have this really cool option to detect edges. And what that does is it looks at the underlying shape and form, and it tries to break up that seam line so that it follows some of these shapes. And you can control that by using the threshold. So you can see that if I adjust my threshold, so I'm going to do something like maybe this, you can just make changes to how you want that seam. In an organic material like this works awesome. And if you're working with something that's maybe a bit more geometric, like it could be some type of like fabric pattern that it has to align a pattern, I can hold down the Alt or the Option key, and it'll let me resize this transform manipulator just on a specific axis. And so you can use this to kind of help line up geometric patterns. That's one thing that you can do. There's some other tools as well. I'll kind of show you a little bit about that in a second. But for right now, you can see that, again, we're just kind of breaking this up. We also have a grid resolution that you can change. So usually I don't really mess with that. So I'm just going to click this reset to default. I think it's at 9 by default. You can also see here that it's performing this operation across all the channels at the same time. So I'm just looking at base color because in my case, it's just a little easier to see. But it depends. Sometimes the base color has hardly any detail in it. And you're like, oh, you know what? If I jump over to my height information, there's detail here. It's a little easier for me to see what the seams are doing. But in this case, this works pretty well. So let's turn off the show seam and let's zoom in really, really close. And let me focus like on this area. So you can see the way this is cutting the image. I can see, well, there's a darker value, right next to a light value, and that seam line that's being created, you can see it right here. It's super sharp. Well, no problem. I can just adjust the blur, and then just like that, we could just make that seam completely kind of disappear into the image. So that's all we got to do with that. Just increase that, add just a little bit of blur to that. Now, something else we can do that's really cool about this tool, let's go back to show seam. And so we have this seam that's being generated for us automatically, but if you want to, you can control that. Now, it's not really needed in this image, but let me show you how it works. You can come over to this area, this option here called Paint Seam Cut. So we're going to enable this, and then I could input a mask, or I can click the Paint button, and this gives me my Paint tool here in Sampler. And if I use my bracket key, so my left bracket key will, decrease the brush size, and right bracket key will increase it. So let's decrease the brush size, and then if I come into here and I start to paint, you can see I can control that seam and how it's being generated. So let's say that I want the seam to cut below this little shape here. Well, I'll click the color option, set it to black, and then come in and just paint my seam line so that it kind of paints out around that particular shape. And this is real useful, again, if it was a geometric pattern and you're trying to align this seam line to follow a specific geometric pattern. Like I said, in this case, it's really overkill. I don't need it. But if I mouse out of that 0 to 1 space, I can kind of see more clearly what's going on. And of course, here I'm going to turn off my show seam. So that's what I've generated here, just by using the detect edges, adjusting the blur, and then maybe a little bit of paint seam here to fix it up. But overall, that is going to be my solution for using the tiling tool. So pretty good. Now, in this case, I think that pretty much fixes pretty much everything, I guess. But if I zoom out here a bit, the next phase is you want to start looking at maybe some type of pattern or maybe some detail that's starting to stick out. And, you know, I would say maybe it's this little dark area here. So let's zoom in and let's look at this. So I think what I might do is try to fix that. Now, what I can do is click and add a layer, and you can use something like, we have a content aware fill, which is pretty good, but it takes a little slow to process. So usually what I'll do is just use the clone stamp. So let's place a clone stamp in here. And the clone stamp, you can see it gives me this little point controller here, this little tool, this little widget point, and I can move this around. This little point is the sample point. Now, if I hold down the Alt key and left click, or it's Alt or Command, and left click, lets me place that point really quickly here. So I'm gonna just place the point. I have my paintbrush, and then I'm just gonna paint. And I'm just going to clone out that area. Now, you'll also notice that if I move my threshold, this also gives me that same threshold control. So, you know, I can do that. I can increase the blur. And then again, at any point, I can just move the control. So let's just move this. I'm just kind of cloning out that little shape. And if I want to use another clone stamp tool, I can hold down the Alt tool and then just left click. And that's going to create for me another stamp. So now I have 2 stamps. This time, let's say I want to move this little piece or this little detail. I'm just going to clone that out, adjust my threshold if I need to. I'll lower it so it's not, you know, so large, increase the blur. And then after the fact, I can always move that clone point. So let's maybe move it down here a little bit. So now I have 2 clone points. If I need to go back to the first one here in my layer stack and just select it, I can make adjustments. I can go back to the second, make adjustments, paint, or add additional clones. So you have like these little clone stamp operations, multiple clone stamp operations within this clone stamp filter here in the layer stack. And with that said, that is now going to take care of my material. So if I zoom out here in my 2D view, I can see that, okay, overall, nothing's sticking out too bad. I could keep a little bit of dark value here I might want to tweak, but overall, this is pretty good. Let's take a look at our 3D view. We've got a nice seamless texture here, and this is exactly what I was going for. So also in the 3D view, if I jump over to my tiling option, by default, it's repeating by 2, but I'm going to just, you know, set this to 4 so I can get an idea, even a more clear idea of how the tiling's working here. So it looks pretty good already. I like this. Now that I'm looking at everything kind of together, I could, let's see, maybe drop back, because everything's non-destructive here in this layer stack. I could drop back to my image to material operation, and I think for this base value, I'm just gonna increase it a little bit more. It feels like it was just a little too specular. And there we go. Okay, overall, I think that's gonna work for what I want. So at that point, I've now created my tiling material. Just a few operations here. If we look at it in my stack, we have image to material. We're doing an upscale to intelligently upscale without losing any detail or loss of quality. We're running an equalize so that we can tile, and then we're fixing up any kind of last little artifacts that are kind of breaking the tiling here with the clone stamp. And that's pretty much it at that point. We have our material. I'm ready to use it. So the next thing I want to do is add some sugar crystals kind of embedded into the gingerbread, and they're there just to mainly like catch a little specular hit. So let's take a look at how we can do that using the Splatter filter. So I'll click Add Layer. Let's do a quick search here for Splatter, and that is going to add the Splatter here to the stack. Now, of course, we're going to drop down here to our layer properties, and let's start just playing with this. So we have an input. We are going to replace this with a single material. So I'm going to set this to 1 for material input. And then we can adjust our grid size. So I can increase the grid size. That's going to give me more of these little splatter shapes. And then, speaking of shapes, let's take a look at the shape. I can adjust the scale. So I'm going to drop this down quite a bit. Let me zoom in a little closer here in my 3D view. So now I have all these little square shapes that are being splattered everywhere. And let's see, there's a lot of other controls here. We've got like scale random. We can adjust this a little bit. We have our position random, which we want to do. That just helps keep things looking a little bit more chaotic. You know, that is a great rule of thumb anytime you're doing any type of texturing. Like the more variation you can add, the more kind of realistic things can look. So we'll do rotation random. And this will pretty much take care of it for the shape. Let me also take a look at the height overall. So there is a setting here for height offset. And check this out. I can actually come over here to the height offset and I can increase or decrease this. And if I decrease it, look at this. It's actually giving me the effect of these shapes. And it is doing a blend with the height below in the layer stack. So I can decrease the height and it kind of pushes these shapes down into the surface. And that's, again, exactly what I want to do. Okay, so I think that's enough here for just these basic settings here for splatter. Now, like I said, I want to replace the splatter with a material instead of just this gray color. So I'm going to come over to my assets, and in the material starter assets, there's this base material. This is going to work great. Let's left click, drag and drop, and place it right here on the input for the splatter. And so that gives me a material to work with. So here we have this. Now what we want to do is come into here and start to make some adjustments. So for the color, I don't want this to be mid-gray, but I don't want it to be like full white. Whenever you're creating any kind of physically based materials, you always want to avoid like a 1.0 white or a 0.0 black. So let's just, we can even tint it if we wanted, but we can just drop this color value down slightly, maybe something like that. I think that's going to work for now. Let's adjust the roughness value. So I'm going to lower that quite a bit. Move my light around, see what we're getting. Now this is kind of weird, but I'm going to increase the metallic value. So yeah, I'm putting metallic chips into my gingerbread. I definitely don't want to eat this myself, but it's kind of a good trick sometimes, just introducing a little bit of metallic, even though it's not physically correct. Again, this isn't real life. This is 3D. And so we're just, using this to kind of help just get these little specular hits. And that's kind of what I want to do. If you notice, as I move my material around, this is what I'm looking for, these little hits, these little specular hits. Let's see, what else can we do with this? Now that we're starting to see things come together, I might want to jump back to my splatter. Let's look at the shape and let's lower the scale down even more. Okay, so that is looking a little bit better. Now, within this splatter control, there is an awesome setting here that I want to show you. If we scroll down and we come over here to the normal channel, and let me look at the normal channel itself here in the 2D view. So we'll hit normal. So right now, we don't see this shape in the normal map. But there is this really cool option here called normal angle random. And as I start to increase this value, you'll see that now the normal is starting to show up. But the more we increase that, this is a great feature because it's adding normal information to the normal channel, but each one of these shapes has a different normal direction. So that just means that the light can reflect. It's basically going to have the light reflect in different directions. And that's really what I want to do here. So again, as I start to move around, you can see that, you can sort of see it in this one here. I'm getting a little bit, let's zoom in really close. I'm getting some specular hit on this one, but not really on this one because it's rotated in a different direction and the normal's reacting differently. It's a pretty awesome setting. So again, I'll move my light like this and you can see that now we're starting to get these little bitty specular hits, and as I move the light, they're hitting at different times. Really the effect I was going for. So the idea is that I just have a little bit of these little like kind of sugar crystals just kind of embedded here into the gingerbread material. And then again, you could tweak this all day long, but maybe I need to adjust the scale slightly so they come out. I don't want to do too much. It's a subtle effect is what I'm going for here. But I think the secret sauce, so to speak, to this effect is definitely going to be this normal angle random value. Okay, so with that, my material is now complete and I can export this. So what I could do is come over here to my export options and I could send this into Substance Painters just by clicking this button. So let's say that I want to take this material and use it to texture in Painter. I can do that. I can send it into Painter, Designer, or Stager. One thing I do want to mention really quickly, if you are going to use this as an SBSAR file, one of the really cool features of Sampler is that you can expose values so that they're editable inside of another Substance application. So for example, with our Splatter, if I wanted to come over to, say, the scale, there's a pen. If I click this pen button, now when I export this and say view it in, say, Substance Painter, this scale slider will be available. So if I need to tweak this outside of Sampler, I can do that, which is really super powerful and useful. Now, I'm talking about Substance Painter, but any application, any 3D application that supports the Substance material, so that could be like Blender, Maya, Max, Cinema 4D, like any of these apps, they can support the Substance plugin through our free plugin that you can grab. And so that makes this really, really useful. So again, looking at the export options, if I click Export As for the material settings, you can see that the format is selected as a Substance 3D asset file, so SBSAR. Another option would be to maybe not use the Substance material. Let's say that I just want a series of PNG files. And then for a preset, maybe I'm going to Blender, so I could choose Blender here. Or if I'm using Redshift, which I love Redshift as a renderer, I could choose Redshift and so on and so forth. So it depends. You don't have to use the Substance file. You can if you want to maybe expose parameters and have, if you're using it specifically in a Substance application, works great. You get one file for transferring all of your maps. Or if you want here, you can just export out a series of images. Now on the channels to export, this Redshift is a little bit out of date, so I can see it's kind of using like an older version, which wasn't specifically working with PBR Metal Rough. But again, you can even manage your presets and create your own if you want. Now, one last thing I forgot to mention. So we finished our material, and I am going to go back to my layer stack, and here is where I'm going to re-enable that upscale. So I'm going to click upscale. You can see now that my resolution is now changing. So we had our base material. You notice that this says document at 2048, and that's because my document resolution is set to 2048. But the upscale is going to double that. So if I go to upscale, it's going to double. So what I'm going to do now is you can see that, well, it did upscale, but then the document resolution is scaling it back down to 2048. So here for my final output is where I want to set this to 4096. So like I said, this is after I've done all my work, and I'm ready to recompute everything in my layer stack at this 4K. And the upscale, again, the whole point of using the upscale is just to intelligently upscale that source image, which was a default kind of embedded resolution of 2K by 2K. So we do an intelligent upscale so we don't lose any quality, and then we work in 4K for our final export. So here's a final image where I used this material for these gingerbread cookies. Now in this version, I didn't have the sugar crystals. I had just thought of that for this tutorial. But here you can see the overall kind of look of me applying and using this material in an actual scene. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.